In the sterile bay of Theta 9, Samantha Reeves saw what others called a failed experiment, a small hybrid dragon with haunted blue eyes deemed unworthy of life. But when their gazes met, she saw something no one else did. Not a problem to be solved, but a soul waiting to be recognized. Bay 7 contained only white surfaces and harsh lighting, every corner gleaming under sterile lights. The air hummed with the sound of filtration systems maintaining a controlled atmosphere. In the center of this clinical space rested a single containment unit, its transparent walls revealing the room's sole occupant. The creature inside moved with a slow, pained rhythm that spoke of constant discomfort. Medical staff had classified him as XG779, a designation that appeared on all his charts and files. His record showed multiple system failures that made sustained life support increasingly difficult. The medical team noted deteriorating respiratory function, digestive complications, and compromised immune responses. Each report concluded that continued care represented an inefficient allocation of limited resources rather than meaningful treatment. His official file contained a clear recommendation for euthanasia, signed by 3 senior medical officers. They described his condition as beyond recovery, his suffering as persistent and untreatable. The documentation emphasized the humane necessity of ending what they termed a failed biological experiment. No one had contested this assessment among the medical staff. A silver scar crossed his forehead, where neural interface equipment had been attached during previous procedures. The mark showed clean edges where surgical instruments had made contact with his skin. His breathing came in shallow, labored pulls against the artificial atmosphere. Each inhalation seemed to require conscious effort rather than natural reflex. Patches of thinning fur revealed pale skin along his back and sides where stress had taken its toll. The orange-brown coloring that should have been vibrant instead looked dull and patchy. His wings remained tightly folded against his body, the delicate membranes showing no signs of ever having been fully extended. The joints appeared underdeveloped, unable to support flight even in lower gravity. Hybrid specimens often face biological rejection from both natural and engineered environments. Their mixed genetics create systems that conflict with standard support protocols. The medical team saw only charts and readouts, numbers that indicated failure across every measured parameter. They discussed his case in terms of resource allocation and experimental outcomes. The lead physician noted the creature's declining vital signs during morning rounds. Another staff member recorded decreased responsiveness to external stimuli. They prepared the necessary documentation for the termination procedure scheduled for the following day. To them, he represented a problem to be resolved rather than a life to be preserved. Samantha Reeves entered the bay without the usual medical equipment or protective gear. She moved to the containment unit and placed her bare hands against the transparent surface. The creature lifted his head slowly, those blue eyes fixing on her face. Where others saw biological failure, she saw something that made her pause the termination protocols. Samantha approached the transparent enclosure with empty hands. She carried no medical scanner, no nutrient syringe, no data pad for recording observations. Her simple presence contrasted with the usual procession of equipment and protective gear that accompanied staff visits. The creature inside registered her approach with a full-body flinch, pressing himself against the far wall as if trying to merge with the smooth surface. His muscles tensed in preparation for another procedure, another test, another moment of controlled pain. The reaction was automatic, conditioned by countless previous encounters. But his blue eyes held more than just reflexive fear. They tracked her movement with a focus that suggested comprehension beyond basic instinct. The intelligence in that gaze was the first detail the medical teams had overlooked in their assessments. The silver scar across his forehead showed fine lines where interface nodes had connected repeatedly. Each tiny mark represented a session of neural testing, a gathering of data that had ultimately been deemed insufficient for continued investment. The pattern indicated long-term monitoring rather than a single procedure. His small stature reinforced the record, suggesting he was never intended to reach full maturity. The project parameters had likely called for study during early development stages only. Digestive complications meant standard nutrient formulas caused inflammation and rejection. His system couldn't process the efficient, mass-produced solutions used throughout the facility. This biological limitation had been categorized as another system failure rather than a specialized need. Specialists in cross-species research sometimes miss nuanced cognitive signals when focused solely on physiological data. They documented measurable facts rather than interpreting behavioral subtleties. Samantha noticed how his attention followed her hand when she shifted position. The precision of his tracking suggested not just visual acuity, but processing capability. He wasn't merely reacting to movement, but analyzing its patterns and potential meanings. His head tilted slightly when she spoke, the angle suggesting auditory processing rather than simple sound detection. She observed the way his breathing patterns changed when she remained still versus when she moved. The variations indicated situational awareness rather than autonomic function. His eyes maintained contact with hers longer than any animal would without cognitive engagement. The medical reports had documented his declining responsiveness, but they hadn't recorded the quality of that responsiveness when it occurred. Where the files showed biological failure, Samantha recognized a consciousness constrained by trauma and physical limitation. The intelligence in those blue eyes wasn't diminishing, but rather retreating from painful interactions. His apparent unresponsiveness was actually a learned defense mechanism rather than cognitive decline. She saw not a creature failing to respond, but one choosing not to engage with sources of discomfort. The realization shifted her perspective completely. This wasn't a specimen to be euthanized, but a being to be understood. His value wasn't in what he could provide as research data, but in what he represented as a unique form of life. The medical reports had documented everything except the most important fact. There was someone home behind those frightened eyes. Someone who had learned that interaction meant pain. Mitchell Graves met her at the observation window, his expression professionally neutral. He gestured toward the containment unit where the creature lay motionless. The prognosis shows multiple system failures that make recovery unlikely, he said. His respiratory function continues to decline despite optimized atmosphere control. Digestive rejection of all standard nutrient formulas means we can't maintain his nutritional needs. His tone remained clinical. Each fact delivered without emotional weight. The rehabilitation center operated under strict protocols regarding specimen viability. Regulations required termination when life support costs exceeded projected research value. The policies were clear and consistently enforced across all departments. Staff understood that emotional attachments to research subjects compromised objective decision-making. Personal feelings had no place in resource allocation calculations. Samantha reviewed the medical data on the display screen. Charts showed declining respiratory efficiency over the past 30 days. Blood work indicated chronic inflammation and immune system suppression. Metabolic rates had dropped below sustainable levels. The numbers painted a picture of irreversible physiological collapse. Each data point supported the termination recommendation. Maintaining the creature required specialized atmospheric controls and custom nutrient formulations. The environmental systems consumed significant energy resources. Medical monitoring equipment needed constant calibration and maintenance. Staff hours dedicated to his care could be allocated to more promising specimens. The financial calculations made practical sense from an operational perspective. Other staff members had already accepted the inevitable outcome. The veterinary technician had prepared the euthanasia solution. The maintenance team scheduled bay sterilization for the following morning. The records department processed the termination documentation. Nobody questioned the decision because the evidence appeared overwhelming. They saw another failed experiment among many. Protocol emphasized efficient use of limited resources above all else. The facility operated on fixed budgets with predetermined research objectives. Emotional investments in unviable specimens threatened the entire program's sustainability. Rules existed to prevent exactly this kind of situation, where personal attachment might override scientific judgment. The system was designed to eliminate subjectivity from these decisions. Research facilities often develop institutional patterns that prioritize procedure over individual cases. Standardized protocols create efficiency, but sometimes overlook unique circumstances. The pressure to maintain funding and demonstrate progress can overshadow alternative approaches. Systems built for measurable results struggle with cases that don't fit established parameters. Samantha considered the ethical dimensions of terminating a being that showed clear signs of consciousness. The medical data described biological functions but ignored cognitive evidence. She recalled the intelligence in those blue eyes, the deliberate tracking of her movements. Ending a life that demonstrated awareness felt fundamentally different from discontinuing a failed experiment. The distinction between specimen and person mattered. She accessed the adoption paperwork typically used for retired research animals. The forms required justification for exceptional circumstances and assumption of all associated costs. She listed her observations of cognitive function and proposed a modified care plan. The submission bypassed standard approval channels, going directly to the ethics committee. Her action represented a direct challenge to established protocols. The system flagged her submission for immediate review, given the scheduled termination. Mitchell Graves received notification simultaneously with the committee members. He looked from the screen to Samantha with visible disbelief. "You're taking full responsibility? The cost alone." His voice trailed off as he read her detailed care proposal. The paperwork committed her personal resources and time to a creature everyone else had written off. She confirmed the submission without hesitation, her decision already made. The adoption request included provisions for ongoing medical monitoring and environmental modifications. She outlined a rehabilitation approach based on trust building rather than medical intervention. The proposal emphasized quality of life over cure, acceptance over correction. She was betting everything on seeing something others had missed. Samantha began visiting the containment bay each morning at the same time, establishing a predictable rhythm in place of the previous random testing schedules. She brought only herself, speaking in quiet tones about ordinary things. The station's atmospheric readings, the progress of other projects, sometimes even describing terrestrial forests she had known as a child. She made no demands, expected no response, and never approached too closely. The dragon remained coiled in his corner, a tight ball of orange-brown fur and folded wings, his breathing shallow but steady. For 3 days he showed no reaction beyond basic awareness of her presence. His eyes would track her movement, but his body remained motionless, conserving energy like an animal in deep hibernation. The sterile white walls reflected the harsh lighting, offering no visual stimulation beyond the occasional shift of shadow as Samantha moved about the space. The air continued its mechanical hum, a constant reminder of the artificial environment. On the 4th morning, she activated the holographic projector installed in the ceiling. The sterile white walls dissolved into a dense, temperate forest, the projection wrapping completely around the containment area. Towering fir trees reached toward a simulated sky, their branches moving with a gentle wind that existed only as light and sound. The forest floor showed detailed undergrowth with ferns and fallen leaves, the projection so precise that individual pine needles were visible on the lower branches. Subtle audio cues emerged from hidden speakers, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through underbrush. The sounds were layered at varying distances, creating a convincing depth to the artificial environment. The lighting shifted to mimic dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, with occasional patches of brighter illumination, where the virtual sun broke through gaps in the foliage. The dragon's head lifted slowly from the floor, his neck extending with visible effort. His blue eyes widened, reflecting the shifting patterns of light and shadow that danced across the enclosure. The pupils dilated to take in more of the unfamiliar visual information, the movement deliberate rather than reflexive. His ears, previously flattened against his skull, rotated forward to capture the new auditory stimuli. Environmental enrichment often triggers neurological responses in traumatized creatures by engaging senses that have been dormant or underutilized. The introduction of natural patterns and sounds can stimulate brain activity in ways that artificial environments suppress. The combination of visual complexity and ambient natural noise creates cognitive engagement where sterile surroundings promote withdrawal. His nostrils flared repeatedly, sampling air that still carried only the sterile facility scent. The movement suggested instinctive behavior, an attempt to process olfactory information that should accompany the visual display of pine forest. His head turned slowly from side to side, following the movement of virtual branches as they swayed in the non-existent breeze. The tight coil of his body began to loosen, muscles relaxing incrementally. The defeated posture that had characterized his previous days gradually eased. His gaze lost its hollow quality, gaining focus and curiosity as it tracked a simulated bird flying between tree branches. The transformation wasn't dramatic but fundamental. a shift from passive endurance to active engagement. The spark of interest in his eyes marked the first break in the wall of trauma that had isolated him from his environment. Samantha remained still, observing the change without comment or movement. She watched as he continued to study the forest projection, his breathing pattern deepening slightly. The moment represented more than simple distraction. It was the first indication that connection might be possible through means other than medical procedures or forced interactions. His attention remained fixed on the shifting light patterns, completely absorbed in the artificial forest. Samantha stood before the holographic forest projection, watching the dragon who had begun responding to the artificial environment. The designation XG779 still appeared on all official documentation, a sterile string of letters and numbers that reduced him to data points and experimental parameters. She needed a name that acknowledged his origins while honoring the transformation she believed possible. The choice required careful consideration of both his past suffering and future potential. The tension inherent in naming lay in what it would represent for their relationship and his status within the facility. Giving him a true name would shift him permanently from specimen to individual in her eyes and potentially in the eyes of others. It would create expectations and commitments that went beyond basic caretaking. The act would cross an invisible boundary between professional responsibility and personal connection, changing how she interacted with him and how the staff perceived her involvement. His laboratory designation served as an identifier for record-keeping rather than an acknowledgement of personhood. XG779 categorized him as the 779th experiment in the X-Genesis series, placing him within a sequence of attempts rather than recognizing his unique existence. The numbers implied replaceability and disposability, suggesting that another specimen could easily take his place in the research protocols. The designation carried no meaning beyond its function in the filing system. The mythical phoenix represented cyclical rebirth through fire, emerging renewed from its own ashes. The symbolism resonated with his circumstances, a creature literally rising from what others considered his end. The parallel extended beyond metaphor into physical reality, as his continued survival despite medical predictions mirrored the legendary bird's resurrection. The name suggested not just recovery, but transformation into something stronger than before. His physical appearance reinforced the choice conceptually. The orange-brown fur coloring echoed the hues of firelight and ashes, particularly where it grew thicker and healthier around his shoulders and back. The silver scar across his forehead could be seen as marking the fire he had passed through, rather than just recording past injuries. Even his improved breathing patterns suggested embers stirring to life rather than a system shutting down. The act of naming establishes emotional bonds between caregivers and those in their care by creating personal connection beyond functional relationship. It transforms anonymous subjects into individuals with identities separate from their circumstances. The process involves seeing and acknowledging the essence of the being, rather than just their practical needs or problems. It represents a commitment to recognizing their unique presence in the world. Cultures throughout human history have understood naming as an act of conferring identity and value. The assignment of a name often accompanies rituals welcoming new members into families or communities. Being unnamed typically signifies lack of status or personhood within social structures. The reverse process, giving a name to something previously designated by function or number, can restore dignity and acknowledge inherent worth. She waited until the forest hologram reached its midday cycle. With virtual sunlight filtering through the pine canopy, the dragon watched the light patterns with apparent interest, his head tilted slightly as he followed the movement of leaves. Samantha moved closer to the enclosure than usual, her hands resting lightly against the transparent barrier. She spoke the single word softly, letting it hang in the air between them. The sound caught his attention immediately. His ears rotated toward her voice, the movement precise and deliberate. He turned his head slowly, those blue eyes focusing on her face with renewed intensity. The response wasn't the reflexive reaction to unexpected noise, but rather conscious engagement with the specific vocalization. His gaze held hers for a long moment before he looked back toward the forest projection. The new name apparently integrated into his understanding of their interaction. The acceptance felt like permission to continue. Samonette prepared the specialized nutrient mixture exactly as she had for 6 previous mornings, measuring each component with careful precision. The formula differed significantly from standard issue, containing enzymes to aid digestion and nutrients broken down into more easily processed forms. She heated it to the optimal temperature, testing it against her wrist as she might for an infant. The scent was mild and earthy rather than the sharp chemical odor of laboratory supplements. She carried the bowl into the containment area and placed it on the floor halfway between them, then retreated to her usual position against the far wall. Phoenix watched the procedure with guarded attention, his blue eyes tracking the bowl's movement but showing no interest in its contents. His body remained coiled in its defensive posture, wings tight against his sides. The memory of forced feeding procedures clearly influenced his reaction. The expectation of hands holding him down, tubes causing discomfort, the violation of personal space. He associated food with coercion rather than sustenance or pleasure. His digestive system presented unique challenges that made eating an uncomfortable experience. Medical scans revealed chronic inflammation throughout his gastrointestinal tract, with particular sensitivity in the intestinal lining. The standard nutrient solutions caused cramping and rejection responses that created negative associations with feeding. Even the specialized formula carried some risk of discomfort, though significantly reduced from previous options. The physical reality of digestion involved pain rather than satisfaction for him. Research into traumatized animals demonstrates that voluntary eating requires established trust before hunger can overcome fear. The biological drive for nourishment becomes secondary to the psychological need for safety. Subjects will often choose starvation over perceived threat, their survival instincts overridden by learned defensive behaviors. The caregiver's presence must signal security rather than danger for feeding to occur naturally. Samantha took her familiar position and opened a datapad, appearing to read while maintaining peripheral awareness of Phoenix's movements. She kept her posture relaxed and non-threatening, her attention apparently absorbed by the screen. The strategy involved creating an atmosphere of normalcy rather than focused expectation. She remained perfectly still except for the occasional turning of a page, establishing a calm presence without pressure or demand. For 6 days the pattern repeated without variation. She would place the bowl, retreat to her spot, and remain quietly present while the food cooled and eventually solidified. Phoenix would watch the bowl for a time, then gradually lose interest as no forced interaction occurred. The uneaten meals were removed and replaced with fresh portions according to schedule. The process required patience as trust built incrementally through consistent, non-threatening exposure. On the 7th morning, something shifted in Phoenix's behavior. He uncoiled slightly from his defensive position, his head lifting higher than usual. His nostrils flared as he sampled the air, catching the scent of the warm nutrients. He watched Samantha for a longer period than before, his gaze moving between her face and the food bowl with apparent calculation. The tension in his body seemed different, less defensive, more contemplative. He rose slowly on trembling legs, the movement requiring visible effort after days of minimal activity. His steps were hesitant but deliberate as he approached the bowl, his eyes never leaving Samantha's face. He paused twice during the short distance, watching for any change in her posture or expression. When he reached the bowl, he lowered his head cautiously, still maintaining eye contact. His first bite was small and tentative, more sampling than eating. The movement was entirely voluntary, unprompted by any external pressure or manipulation. The significance extended beyond nutrition to psychological breakthrough. The act represented his first autonomous decision regarding his care, a choice made from trust rather than compliance. The small bite of food marked the beginning of his active participation in his own recovery, shifting him from passive patient to engaged participant. Samantha maintained her established routine of visits without attempting physical contact, allowing weeks to pass without crossing that particular boundary. She entered the containment area each morning, sometimes speaking quietly, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence while the forest hologram played across the walls. Her movements remained predictable and non-threatening, her hands always visible and her approach never sudden. The consistency built a foundation of security through repetition, rather than dramatic gestures. Any unexpected motion still triggered an instant defensive response from Phoenix. The sound of a door closing too quickly would make him flinch and retreat to the far wall. The appearance of unfamiliar staff members caused immediate tension throughout his body. Even Samantha's occasional adjustments to the hologram settings required careful, gradual movements to avoid startling him. The trauma responses remained close to the surface despite the progress in other areas. She observed him watching her hands with particular intensity during her visits. His blue eyes would follow the movement of her fingers when she gestured or adjusted her datapad, the focus more concentrated than when he looked at her face. The attention suggested both wariness and curiosity about what those hands might do. They represented both potential threat and possible comfort, their intentions unclear based on his previous experiences. His neural interface experiences had created strong negative associations with human touch. The silver scar across his forehead marked where equipment had been attached for monitoring and testing procedures. Each session had involved restraint and discomfort, making physical contact synonymous with violation rather than care. The memory of those procedures influenced his reactions more than any instinctive fear, the learned response overriding natural curiosity. Mitchell Graves observed through the viewing window, his expression skeptical as he watched Samantha's approach. He had seen numerous attempts to rehabilitate damaged specimens fail at this stage. The files contained multiple examples of well-intentioned caregivers pushing too quickly and destroying fragile trust. He expected another failed intervention, another setback that would confirm the original termination recommendation. His presence represented the institutional expectation of failure. Research into trauma recovery shows that positive touch can create new neural pathways that override previous negative associations. The process requires careful timing and complete absence of pressure, allowing the subject to initiate or reject contact on their terms. Successful interventions involve creating experiences so fundamentally different from previous trauma that they rewrite the emotional memory associated with physical interaction. Samantha moved with deliberate slowness, keeping her hand visible at all times. She approached at an angle rather than directly, giving Phoenix clear opportunity to retreat if desired. Her fingers remained relaxed rather than reaching, the palm open and non-threatening. The movement communicated invitation rather than intention, leaving the choice entirely with him. Her breathing remained steady, avoiding any tension that might transmit anxiety. Phoenix held his position rather than retreating, his body tense but not frozen in panic. His breathing quickened slightly, but maintained a steady rhythm rather than the ragged gasps of true fear. His eyes remained fixed on her hand, watching its approach with intense focus. The slight tremble in his limbs suggested internal conflict between fear and curiosity. The moment stretched as the distance between them diminished incrementally. Her fingers made first contact with the silver scar tissue on his forehead, the touch light as breathing. The sensation was entirely different from the cold pressure of medical equipment or restraining hands. The warmth of her skin against his marked forehead created a new sensory experience unrelated to previous procedures. He remained perfectly still for 3 heartbeats, then leaned forward into the contact, increasing the pressure of the connection. The movement was deliberate, conscious, and entirely his own choice. The medical bay remained problematic as a permanent environment for Phoenix's recovery. Every surface reflected the harsh lighting, every corner smelled of antiseptic solutions, and every piece of equipment carried associations with painful procedures. The place represented everything he needed to move beyond: the constant monitoring, the clinical atmosphere, the memory of invasive tests. Even with improvements in his condition, the surroundings reinforced trauma rather than supporting healing. Samantha knew a true recovery required more than just medical care. It needed an environment designed for psychological as well as physical well-being. Moving him posed serious risks, given his fragile respiratory system. The transfer between environments could trigger stress responses that compromised his breathing. The medical team expressed concern about atmospheric variations between sections of the station. Even minor changes in air pressure or composition might cause setbacks after weeks of careful progress. The journey would require passing through corridors with different environmental controls, each transition presenting potential challenges. The sedation necessary for safe transport carried its own risks for a creature with his complex physiology. She began modifying her quarters to create a specialized habitat. Climate control units were installed to maintain optimal air quality, specific to his respiratory needs. The system filtered particulates and maintained precise humidity levels to support his delicate lung tissue. Temperature controls kept the environment within a narrow range that matched his metabolic requirements. The air circulation patterns were adjusted to prevent drafts while ensuring fresh oxygenation. Every atmospheric parameter received careful consideration based on his medical data. The forest hologram projector became a permanent feature mounted in the main living area. Its programming expanded to include full diurnal cycles with gradual transitions between dawn, daylight, dusk, and night phases. The artificial sunlight patterns shifted throughout the day, casting different shadows and creating varied lighting conditions. The soundscape incorporated seasonal variations with appropriate wildlife activity and weather patterns. The projection covered 3 walls completely, creating an immersive environment that replaced sterile white surfaces with simulated nature. Climbing structures of varying heights and complexities allowed him to build strength safely. The installations included textured perches at different levels, gently sloping ramps, and secure platforms for resting. The materials were chosen for both durability and comfort, with surfaces that provided traction without being abrasive. The arrangement encouraged natural movement patterns while minimizing risk of falls or injuries. The structures positioned near viewing ports allowed observation of station activity from secure vantage points. Environmental design plays a crucial role in trauma recovery cases. The physical space can either support healing or reinforce negative associations. Carefully planned environments reduce stress by providing security, comfort, and opportunities for natural behaviors. The presence of familiar elements creates psychological safety, while new features encourage exploration and engagement. The balance between protection and stimulation requires thoughtful planning based on individual needs and preferences. The transfer procedure involved a medical team monitoring his vital signs throughout the process. They administered a carefully measured sedative to keep him calm, without depressing his respiratory function. The transport capsule maintained his optimal atmospheric conditions during movement through the station corridors. Samantha walked beside the capsule, her presence providing continuity despite the unfamiliar activity. The medical team remained alert for any signs of distress during the transition. He woke slowly in the new environment, his eyes opening to unfamiliar surroundings. The sedative wore off gradually, allowing him to register the changes incrementally. His head lifted from the bedding, nostrils flaring as he sampled the different air quality. The forest projection showed early morning light filtering through virtual trees, creating soft shadows across the room. His gaze moved across the climbing structures, the viewing ports, the various perches, and resting areas. The disorientation gradually gave way to curiosity as he recognized elements from his previous environment, integrated into the new space. His breathing pattern settled into a deeper rhythm almost immediately. In the optimized atmosphere, the air moved with a gentle circulation that carried subtle scents of the simulated forest, rather than chemical cleaners. The lighting maintained a soft quality that didn't irritate his eyes. He uncurled from his resting position and moved to the foot of Samantha's bed, arranging himself where he could maintain visual contact with both her and the room's entrance. The ease of his breathing reflected both improved air quality and reduced stress in the new environment. The physical changes began subtly, then accelerated as weeks passed in the optimized environment. Regular nutrition from the specialized formula provided building blocks for tissue repair, while reduced stress levels allowed his body to redirect energy from survival mechanisms to healing processes. The transformation became visible in his posture first. The constant tension in his shoulders eased, his neck extended more freely, his movements lost their defensive quality. His body slowly began reflecting the psychological progress he had made. His wing membranes presented the most persistent physical challenge despite other improvements. The delicate tissues remained thin and fragile, showing only minimal development even as the rest of his body strengthened. The joints lacked the full range of motion needed for proper extension, and the muscles supporting flight remained underdeveloped compared to his body mass. Each attempt to stretch them revealed limitations that would require months of gradual progress to overcome, if they could be overcome at all. His fur underwent the most dramatic visible transformation. The orange-brown coloring grew rich and uniform, losing the patchy appearance caused by stress-induced shedding. The texture thickened into a healthy coat that provided better insulation and protection. Where bare skin had shown through in places, new growth filled in completely, creating a continuous covering that reflected improved nutrition and reduced cortisol levels. The change made him appear larger, more substantial, less like the fragile creature he had been. The neural interface scar on his forehead faded from its initial angry red to a pale silver line. The tissue lost its inflamed appearance as the chronic stress response diminished. The mark became less prominent against his fur, transitioning from a glaring reminder of past procedures to a simple physical feature. The change reflected both reduced inflammation and improved circulation to the area, allowing proper healing to occur where only maintenance of injury had been possible before. He began stretching his wings voluntarily during morning routines, extending them carefully as if testing their capabilities. The movements started small, brief extensions that barely unfolded the membranes before folding them again. Gradually, the stretches became more deliberate, holding the position longer and achieving fuller extension. The action appeared purposeful rather than reflexive, suggesting increased awareness and control over previously neglected anatomy. Research into trauma recovery shows that reduced stress hormones create physiological conditions conducive to healing. Lower cortisol levels improve immune function, reduce inflammation, and allow resources to shift from emergency response systems to repair mechanisms. The body begins functioning optimally when not constantly preparing for threat, enabling improvements that seemed impossible under chronic stress. His respiratory function showed measurable improvement in daily monitoring. The labored breathing that had characterized his early days gave way to smoother, deeper respirations. The medical sensors recorded increased oxygen saturation and better gas exchange efficiency. The need for atmospheric support decreased incrementally until he maintained stable levels in normal station air, with only the specialized filters in his quarters providing slight optimization. He started attempting short glides from the lowest perches in his climbing structures. The initial attempts covered minimal distance and ended with awkward landings, but they represented significant progress. The coordination required for even these basic aerial movements demonstrated improved neuromuscular control and body awareness. Each attempt built strength in the underused flight muscles and stretched the delicate membranes more completely. His physical form gradually aligned with his emerging confidence and engagement. The body that had been a source of limitation and pain became increasingly capable and responsive. The transformation wasn't about achieving perfection, but about reaching a state where his physical capabilities could support his expanding activities and interactions. The recovery became integrated rather than partial, with each system supporting the others in a reinforcing cycle of improvement. Samantha noticed the change first in how Phoenix positioned himself when maintenance staff entered their quarters. His movements became deliberate rather than reactive, his posture shifting from defensive to observant. Where he would previously retreat to the farthest corner at any unfamiliar presence, he now remained near the center of the room, his attention fixed on the newcomers. The transformation occurred gradually over several weeks, becoming more pronounced as his confidence grew in the environment he now considered his territory. The potential for misunderstanding his behavior was significant. Security protocols viewed any aggressive posturing from non-domesticated species as a threat requiring response. His increased size and improved physical condition made him appear more formidable than the fragile creature they had previously known. The medical team still carried memories of his early fragility and might misinterpret protective behavior as regression to fear-based responses. The line between guarding and threatening could be thin in the eyes of those unfamiliar with his progress. He began placing himself between Samantha and anyone entering the space, moving with a smooth coordination that suggested purpose rather than panic. His body aligned at an angle that maintained visual contact with both her and the visitor, creating a physical barrier without blocking movement entirely. The positioning was calculated, allowing intervention if needed while permitting normal interaction to continue. His eyes tracked the stranger's hands and equipment with particular intensity, assessing potential threats based on previous negative experiences. His vocalizations shifted from the high-pitched distress calls of his early days to deeper, resonant tones when unfamiliar people entered. The sound served as both warning and communication, alerting Samantha to the presence of others while signaling the visitors that they were being monitored. The change reflected his developing voice rather than attempted aggression, the notes carrying more confidence than threat. The frequency and pitch varied depending on the individual entering, suggesting discrimination between different types of visitors. The creature who had once hidden from all human contact now moved through his environment with evident ownership. His steps were confident on the climbing structures, his resting positions chosen for optimal visibility rather than concealment. He investigated new objects introduced to the space with curiosity rather than fear, examining them carefully before accepting or rejecting their presence. His entire demeanor reflected an animal that had transitioned from surviving to thriving within his territory. Animals, recovering from severe trauma, often develop protective behaviors toward those who facilitated their recovery. The transformation represents a psychological shift from self-preservation to social bonding, where the focus expands beyond individual safety to include the well-being of others. The behavior demonstrates successful integration of positive experiences that override previous negative associations. The protective instinct emerges from gratitude rather than anxiety, from strength rather than fear. He learned to distinguish between regular staff members and unfamiliar visitors through subtle cues. Maintenance crew wearing standard uniforms elicited minimal response beyond basic monitoring. Medical personnel carrying equipment cases prompted closer observation and positioning near Samantha. Complete strangers without identification badges triggered full alert posture with vocal warnings. His assessment system became increasingly sophisticated, recognizing patterns and routines that indicated normal versus unusual activity. His protective stance remained primarily observational rather than confrontational. He rarely advanced toward visitors, preferring to maintain a watchful distance that allowed assessment without escalation. His body language communicated awareness rather than aggression, readiness rather than attack. The approach minimized conflict while clearly establishing his role as guardian of the space. The balance demonstrated sophisticated social intelligence in managing interactions within shared environment. Phoenix had completed the transition from victim to guardian, from specimen to sentinel. His protection of Samantha and their shared space represented the full integration of his recovered confidence with his developing social bonds. The behavior wasn't based on fear of others, but on commitment to what he now valued. The transformation marked the final stage of his psychological recovery, where he could extend security to others rather than simply seeking it for himself. Mitchell Graves entered the habitat carrying 3 transport containers stacked in a secure frame. The units were standard issue for specimen transfer, their opaque sides hiding the contents but not containing the scent that emanated from the ventilation filters. The odor reached Phoenix first, a complex mix of fear pheromones, unfamiliar dragon scent, and the distinct antiseptic smell of medical facilities. His head shot up from where he had been resting, his body tensing immediately at the intrusion of unfamiliar biological signatures into his territory. Phoenix's reaction was immediate and defensive. His wings lifted slightly from his body, creating a larger silhouette. A low rumble emerged from his chest, the sound vibrating through the floor plates. His eyes fixed on the containers with intense focus, the blue irises contracting against the perceived threat. The transformation from relaxed guardian to alert sentinel happened within seconds, his entire posture shifting to protective readiness. Samantha moved to intervene, placing herself between Phoenix and the newcomers to moderate the interaction. The 3 juveniles inside the carriers were visibly smaller than Phoenix, their bodies curled tightly in defensive positions. Sterling showed silver-gray scaling along his back with faint striations that caught the light. Copper displayed warmer reddish-brown coloring with coppery highlights along his wing membranes. Goldie had pale golden fur with darker speckling across her shoulders. Their sizes suggested they were several developmental stages behind Phoenix, perhaps never having reached their intended growth potential due to early trauma. Each juvenile bore the telltale silver scar across the forehead where neural interfaces had been attached. The mark showed similar placement and surgical precision to Phoenix's own scar, indicating standardized testing procedures across the Genesis program. Their respiratory patterns appeared labored even within the controlled atmosphere of the carriers, suggesting shared physiological challenges with oxygen processing. Visible patches of thinning fur showed on their bodies where stress had taken its toll, mirroring Phoenix's earlier condition. The 3 newcomers remained huddled together in a tight cluster of frightened bodies. Their eyes were wide with terror, showing no recognition or trust toward their surroundings. They flinched at any movement beyond their carriers, their bodies trembling with constant anxiety. No attempt at exploration or curiosity emerged, only the frozen posture of animals expecting further harm. Their interaction was limited to pressing against each other for minimal comfort, forming a small island of shared fear in the unfamiliar environment. Social species often learn trust more effectively from their own kind than from human caregivers. The process involves observing behaviors and reactions in creatures that share their biology and experiences. A recovered individual can demonstrate safety through actions that humans cannot replicate authentically. The teaching occurs through mirroring and imitation rather than instruction, creating organic learning that bypasses the need for language or explanation. Phoenix approached the carriers with careful movements, his defensive posture gradually giving way to curiosity. His nostrils flared repeatedly as he sampled the air around the containers, analyzing the scent signatures they released. The low rumble in his chest diminished to a softer vibrational sound, more inquiry than warning. His head tilted as he examined the containers from different angles, his attention focused but no longer aggressive. He recognized the scent components that matched his own biological signature, the particular musk of dragon hybrid physiology, the subtle notes that indicated shared genetic manipulation. The fear pheromones were also familiar, triggering memories of his own early terror in the medical bay. The combination created a complex sensory picture that connected him to these newcomers through shared experience, rather than just species similarity. His interest became clearly visible in his body language. The defensive wing positioning relaxed into a more neutral stance. The rumbling ceased completely, replaced by soft clicking sounds in the back of his throat. He moved closer to the containers, his approach slow but deliberate, showing none of the aggression that had marked his initial reaction. The transformation from threat assessment to curious investigation occurred without external guidance, driven by innate recognition of kinship. Samantha introduced the juveniles to the main habitat area gradually, starting with short supervised visits while Phoenix observed from a distance. She allowed them to explore the space in stages, beginning with the perimeter before moving toward the central areas. The process emphasized patience over progress, letting each dragon set their own pace for acclimation. The forest hologram provided familiar visual background while they navigated the unfamiliar physical space. The young dragons maintained their fearful posture throughout the initial introductions. Sterling remained pressed against the wall nearest the exit, his silver-gray scales flattened tight against his body. Goldie stayed hidden behind climbing structures, only her golden speckled fur visible between the perches. Copper ventured slightly further than the others, but still jumped at minor sounds or movements. Their reactions showed no signs of trust developing, despite the safe environment and careful handling. Phoenix watched from his preferred resting platform, his blue eyes tracking each juvenile's movements without interference. He made no attempt to approach or interact during the first several days of their introduction. His observation appeared thoughtful rather than territorial, assessing rather than threatening. He noted their individual behaviors and reactions, learning their patterns before engaging directly. The distance he maintained allowed them to become familiar with his presence without feeling pressured. Copper began venturing closer to Phoenix's area as the days passed, her movements tentative but increasingly confident. The reddish-brown dragon would pause frequently during her exploration, watching Phoenix for any reaction to her approach. She stopped at the edge of what might be considered his territory, respecting the invisible boundary he maintained. Her proximity represented the farthest any juvenile had ventured from the security of their group. She showed clear signs of respiratory difficulty during her explorations, her breathing becoming labored after minimal activity. The pattern mirrored Phoenix's early symptoms, shallow inhalations followed by rapid exhalations that failed to fully oxygenate her system. Her nostrils flared with the effort of pulling in sufficient air, and her sides moved with visible strain. The condition seemed to worsen when she became anxious or exerted herself beyond basic movement. Animals often recognize health issues in others of their species through subtle cues that humans might miss. The recognition can trigger nurturing behaviors even in individuals without previous caregiving experience. The response appears instinctive rather than learned, suggesting deep evolutionary roots in social species. The ability to identify and respond to illness or distress supports group survival through mutual care. Phoenix descended from his platform with deliberate slowness, his movement calculated to avoid startling the already anxious juvenile. He maintained a non-threatening posture, keeping his wings folded and his head lowered slightly. His approach angle allowed Copper clear escape routes if she felt uncomfortable. The distance between them closed gradually, giving her time to process each stage of his advance. He stopped within grooming distance, his head tilting to examine the area around her neural interface scar. The silver mark showed similar placement to his own, though slightly inflamed at the edges. His nostrils flared as he sampled her scent, analyzing the chemical signals of her respiratory distress. He made no sudden moves, allowing her to assess his intentions through prolonged exposure to his calm presence. His first contact was the lightest touch of his tongue against the fur around her scar. The grooming motion was gentle and repetitive, working through the matted areas with careful precision. The action served both practical cleaning and social bonding functions, a dual-purpose behavior common in social species. The rhythm established a calming pattern that seemed to ease her breathing almost immediately. Copper remained still for the initial contact, her body tensed, but not retreating. As the grooming continued, her muscles gradually relaxed into the sensation. Her head lowered slightly and she leaned into the contact rather than pulling away. The acceptance represented a significant breakthrough, the first voluntary physical contact between the dragons that wasn't based on fear or necessity. Her breathing pattern deepened as the grooming continued, the respiratory distress easing under the calming influence of the care. The three juveniles observed every interaction between Phoenix and Samantha with intense focus during their first week in the habitat. Their blue eyes followed the pair constantly, missing no detail of how they moved around each other. The young dragons remained hidden behind furniture or climbing structures during these observations, their bodies tense with residual fear. They watched but did not yet participate, learning through silent study rather than direct experience. The tension manifested most clearly during feeding times and human approach. When Samantha brought their nutrient bowls each morning, all three would retreat to the farthest corners, their bodies flattened against walls or hid beneath low platforms, the memory of forced feeding procedures still fresh in their reactions. Any movement toward them triggered instant defensive postures, wings tightening against bodies and heads lowering protectively. The fear response remained stronger than hunger or curiosity at this stage. Phoenix established a new routine at mealtimes, always eating from his bowl first while the juveniles watched. He would approach the food with visible relish, his movements relaxed and confident. His consumption was deliberate and unhurried, demonstrating both the safety and desirability of the nourishment. He made eye contact with the watching juveniles between bites, maintaining connection while modeling the behavior he wanted them to adopt. The demonstration provided living proof that eating could be voluntary rather than forced. He allowed Samantha to handle him freely in their presence, maintaining complete relaxation during physical contact. Her hands would check his wing membranes or examine his healing scar while he remained perfectly still. His breathing stayed even and calm, his eyes half closed with contentment rather than fear. The trust between them was visible in every aspect of their interaction, the ease of movement, the lack of tension, the mutual understanding that passed without words. The display showed the juveniles that human touch could mean comfort rather than pain. His body language during these interactions communicated absolute lack of threat. Where the juveniles crouched and flinched, Phoenix stood tall and relaxed. Where they anticipated danger, he expected safety. The contrast between their fear and his confidence created a powerful visual lesson about the current reality of their environment. His posture said more clearly than any action that they were in a place where threat had been replaced by care. Social creatures learn appropriate behaviors through observing trusted members of their group. The process involves mirroring actions that appear successful or rewarding, building new neural pathways through imitation rather than instruction. Watching positive interactions creates templates for the observer's own future behavior, reducing the need for trial and error learning. The method proves particularly effective for trauma recovery, where direct intervention might reinforce fear responses. Phoenix led them to the climbing structures when they seemed ready for more active exploration. He demonstrated how to navigate the various perches and platforms, moving with deliberate slowness to allow observation. His path choices emphasized safety and stability, avoiding any movements that might seem intimidating or difficult to replicate. He would pause frequently during these demonstrations, looking back to ensure the juveniles were following both physically and visually. The guidance provided practical skills while reinforcing their growing confidence. The young dragons began copying his interactions with Samantha in small increments. They watched how he approached her, how he accepted food from her hands, how he responded to her voice. Their imitation started tentatively, a slight relaxation when she entered the room, a hesitation before retreating, a curious tilt of the head rather than defensive lowering. The changes were subtle but significant, indicating that observation was gradually overriding instinct. Sterling was the first to approach Samantha voluntarily, his silver-gray body moving with hesitant determination. He paused twice during the approach, watching Phoenix for reassurance before continuing. His movement mirrored the exact path and pace that Phoenix used when approaching Samantha, the imitation precise in its execution. He stopped within arm's reach, his head lowered slightly in the same posture Phoenix used when expecting contact. The action represented the first independent act of trust from any juvenile, a direct result of Phoenix's consistent demonstration. The four dragons settled into established patterns that transformed the habitat into a functional social unit. Their daily rhythms developed organically, with specific times for feeding, rest, and activity that all members recognized and followed. Sleeping arrangements formed naturally, with preferred spots and positions that remained consistent from night to night. The routines created stability and predictability within the environment, replacing the chaos of their previous experiences with ordered existence. The space became not just a living area, but a home with its own customs and traditions. Medical staff expressed concerns about resource allocation and stress management within the group dynamic. They worried that competition for food or attention might trigger regression in the recovering dragons. The potential for conflict between individuals with trauma histories presented valid concerns about group stability. Limited space and resources could create tension that undermined individual progress. The team prepared intervention protocols in case aggression or territorial behavior emerged. Phoenix established clear feeding protocols that prevented competition during meals. He always ate first from his designated bowl, consuming his portion completely before turning his attention to the juveniles. His presence during their feeding served as supervision rather than monitoring, ensuring each dragon received adequate nutrition without conflict. He would position himself where he could observe all three juveniles simultaneously, his calm demeanor setting the tone for the interaction. Any attempts at food stealing or bowl invading received immediate, corrective attention through body blocking or gentle nudging rather than aggression. Their sleeping arrangements reflected the developing social bonds between them. The dragons slept curled together in a single cluster, rather than maintaining separate resting places. Their bodies aligned in consistent positions, with Phoenix usually forming the outer boundary that faced the room's entrance. The physical contact during sleep provided warmth and security, reducing nighttime anxiety through shared presence. The arrangement demonstrated trust and comfort levels that individual sleeping would not have achieved. The young dragons mirrored Phoenix's movements and behaviors throughout their waking hours. They followed him during habitat patrols, maintaining careful distance but matching his pace and route. Their head tilts and ear movements copied his alert postures when unfamiliar sounds occurred. Even their breathing patterns synchronized with his during relaxed periods, creating a rhythmic unity among the group. The imitation represented learning through observation rather than instruction, integrating his behaviors into their own developing identities. Created family units sometimes achieve rehabilitation outcomes that individual care cannot provide. The social structure offers multiple learning opportunities through peer observation and interaction. The presence of others who share similar experiences creates understanding that caregivers cannot replicate. The group dynamic supports risk-taking and exploration that might seem too intimidating, attempted alone. The collective confidence often exceeds what individuals could develop in isolation. Phoenix intervened when play behaviors became too rough or one-sided among the juveniles. His approach involved distraction rather than punishment, redirecting energy into alternative activities. He would position himself between conflicting individuals, using his larger size to physically separate them without aggression. His interventions taught appropriate social boundaries through demonstration rather than force. The guidance helped establish norms of interaction that respected individual limits and preferences. He educated them about human behavior through consistent demonstration and reinforcement. His relaxed posture around Samantha indicated safety, while his alert stance with unfamiliar staff signaled caution. He showed them which human movements indicated routine activity versus unusual intrusion. His responses to different voices and footsteps taught them to distinguish between regular visitors and strangers. The lessons provided a framework for understanding human behavior that reduced fear through predictability. Samantha documented the social structure as it solidified into permanence. Her records noted the established routines, feeding patterns, sleeping arrangements, and social interactions. The data showed consistent improvement across all physiological and behavioral metrics since the group formation. Her reports highlighted the stability of their interactions and the absence of conflict or regression. The documentation represented the first successful case of social rehabilitation among Genesis hybrids, providing a model for future efforts. The family unit had become not just a living arrangement but a therapeutic environment in itself. Mitchell Graves compiled the data reports with meticulous attention to detail, organizing the files that documented Phoenix's recovery from condemned experiment to thriving hybrid. The records showed progression through dated entries, respiratory function charts shifting from red alert to stable green, nutritional intake graphs climbing steadily, behavioral logs noting increasing social engagement. The transformation appeared more dramatic when presented sequentially, each week building upon the last in a clear narrative of improvement. The documentation represented not just medical data but a case study in rehabilitation against overwhelming odds. The center's administration remained hesitant about applying the approach more broadly despite the compelling evidence. Senior staff questioned whether the results were reproducible or represented a unique circumstance. They cited the significant resource investment required for individualized care versus standardized protocols. Concerns about scaling personalized treatment to multiple subjects dominated the discussion during review meetings. The skepticism reflected institutional caution rather than opposition, the natural resistance of established systems to unproven methodologies. Dr. Harrison Blackton arrived for his quarterly facility inspection with the usual contingent of colonial authority officials. His tour followed the standard route through research bays and medical facilities, his attention focused on efficiency metrics and compliance reports. The group moved with practice coordination through sterile corridors, their conversation centered on operational matters rather than individual cases. The routine inspection showed no signs of differing from previous visits until they reached the observation window of Phoenix's habitat. The viewing area provided a clear sightline into the transformed living space, where Phoenix interacted with both humans and juveniles. Blackton watched as Samantha entered with feeding bowls, her movements familiar and unthreatening. Phoenix approached her first, accepting his meal with calm confidence before turning to supervise the juveniles. The young dragons followed his lead, their movements showing trust rather than fear. The interaction demonstrated a functional social structure that defied their traumatic origins. The scene presented a living example of successful rehabilitation in action. The medical data accompanying the visual evidence showed physiological improvements that exceeded all predictions. Respiratory efficiency had reached 90% of optimal function, despite early prognoses of irreversible decline. Digestive processing showed complete adaptation to specialized nutrients with no rejection episodes. Immune system markers indicated normal function without pharmaceutical support. The numbers supported what the visual evidence suggested: a comprehensive recovery that addressed both physical and psychological damage. Successful rehabilitation cases often create ripple effects that influence broader policies and practices. The demonstration that a condemned specimen could achieve full recovery challenged established termination protocols. The evidence suggested that individualized approaches might prove more effective than standardized solutions for complex trauma cases. The financial implications of successful rehabilitation versus lifelong supportive care began shifting the cost-benefit calculations. Blackton recognized the potential application for other Genesis program survivors still housed in research facilities. The methods developed for Phoenix could be adapted for hybrids with similar trauma histories and physiological challenges. The approach offered an alternative to permanent medical support or euthanasia for specimens previously considered unviable. The opportunity to improve outcomes across multiple facilities became increasingly apparent as he reviewed the data. The financial analysis showed significant long-term savings compared to ongoing medical maintenance. The initial investment in customized environments and specialized care was offset by reduced monitoring requirements and pharmaceutical costs. The ability to transition subjects from medical dependence to self-sufficiency changed the economic calculations fundamentally. The numbers supported a compelling case for program expansion based on fiscal responsibility as well as ethical considerations. The Colonial Authority approved pilot funding for a scaled rehabilitation initiative based on the documented success. The program would establish dedicated facilities equipped with environmental controls and specialized staff. The approach would prioritize individualized care plans over standardized protocols, adapting methods proven with Phoenix to other Genesis hybrids. The decision represented a fundamental shift in how the Authority viewed and valued created life forms. The pilot program would test whether one dragon's miracle could become a reproducible reality. The flight dome at Station Prime rose like a miniature world contained within transparent alloy, its curved walls reaching higher than any structure Phoenix had encountered. The scale of the space seemed to dwarf the dragon as he stood at the entrance, his head tilting back to take in the impossible height above him. The air carried different qualities here, lighter with subtle movements that suggested open skies rather than controlled environments. His wings tightened against his body in an instinctive response to the vastness, the underdeveloped muscles protesting the potential demands they might face. His wing development remained the one area where progress had been incremental rather than transformative. The membranes had thickened slightly with improved nutrition, but still showed fragility along the leading edges. The joint flexibility had increased through stretching exercises, but lacked the full range needed for powerful flight strokes. The muscles along his back and shoulders had strengthened considerably, yet still seemed inadequate for sustained aerial movement. The limitations represented the final barrier to complete physical recovery, the one aspect of his biology that continued to constrain his potential. The dome environment had been engineered to simulate various flight conditions through precise atmospheric control. Different sections maintained specific air densities that corresponded to various altitudes, allowing gradual acclimation to thinner atmospheres. Temperature zones created thermal currents that rose in predictable patterns, providing natural lift sources for flying creatures. The lighting systems could replicate different times of day and weather conditions, from clear noon brightness to overcast twilight. The entire space functioned as both flight arena and therapeutic environment. Multiple landing platforms dotted the aerial landscape at varying heights and difficulties. The lowest perches stood just above ground level, wide and stable for beginner attempts. Intermediate platforms offered smaller landing areas at moderate heights, requiring better control and precision. The highest perches clung to the dome's upper curvature, accessible only through skilled flight maneuvering. The arrangement allowed progressive challenge building as ability improved, creating a natural pathway from basic gliding to advanced flight. Samantha had designed the environmental parameters based on cross-species research into aerial physiology. The atmospheric composition matched optimal conditions for hybrid respiratory function, while encouraging lung capacity expansion. The thermal current patterns followed natural models that would stimulate wing muscle development through gradual resistance increase. The perch system encouraged increasingly complex flight maneuvers as strength and coordination improved. Every element served both immediate function and long-term developmental goals. Controlled flight environments can trigger physiological improvements that ground-based exercise cannot achieve. The respiratory system benefits from the increased oxygen demand of aerial activity, strengthening lung tissue and improving gas exchange efficiency. Wing muscles develop through actual flight use rather than simulated exercise, creating functional strength matched to specific movement patterns. The neurological pathways for coordination and balance refine themselves through practical application rather than theoretical training. Phoenix hesitated at the threshold, his claws gripping the edge of the entrance platform. The scale of the space seemed to overwhelm his senses, the height and breadth beyond anything in his experience. His nostrils flared as he sampled air currents that felt different from his familiar habitat atmosphere. The wing membranes twitched along his back, half extending then folding again as if uncertain of their capability. The moment stretched as he processed the new environment. weighing curiosity against caution. He began with the most basic aerial movement possible, a short glide between two low platforms barely his own body length apart. The jump required minimal wing extension, just enough to control descent and direction. The landing was awkward but successful, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the textured surface. The distance was trivial but the accomplishment significant. His first voluntary aerial movement outside safe, familiar surroundings. He repeated the short glide multiple times, each attempt showing slightly improved coordination. The confidence grew with each successful landing, the initial hesitation giving way to increasing boldness. He began extending the glide distance incrementally, adding another body length, then another. The wing movements became more deliberate, the extensions fuller and more controlled. The respiratory system adapted to the increased demand, his breathing deepening to accommodate the oxygen requirements. The muscle memory began developing through repetition, creating neural pathways for flight that had lain dormant since his creation. He achieved sustained flight on the 7th attempt, pushing off from a mid-level platform with strong wing strokes that carried him upward, instead of just forward. The thermal currents caught his wings, providing lift that required minimal effort to maintain. His circles began small, just above the lowest platforms, then widened gradually as he gained altitude control. The coordination between wing movement, body position, and respiratory rhythm settled into natural synchrony. He circled the entire dome twice before descending, his landing smooth and controlled on his original platform. The flight represented not just physical achievement but complete integration of his recovered capabilities. The rehabilitation program expanded from a single station to 12 facilities across the colony network over the following years. Each new location adapted the core principles developed through Phoenix's recovery to their specific resources and space constraints. The expansion required training specialized staff and modifying existing medical bays into therapeutic environments. The network allowed transfer of knowledge and resources between facilities, creating a support system that hadn't existed during Phoenix's early isolation. Every dragon arriving at these facilities presented unique combinations of trauma and physiological challenges. Some showed respiratory damage more severe than Phoenix's initial condition. Their breathing labored even with maximum support. Others displayed neurological damage from prolonged interface testing, their movements uncoordinated and responses delayed. Digestive systems varied widely in their capacity to process available nutrients, requiring customized formulas for each new arrival. The diversity of conditions meant standardized protocols remained ineffective, despite the expanded program. Phoenix's case provided the foundational model for all subsequent rehabilitation efforts. His medical records established baseline parameters for expected recovery timelines across different systems. His behavioral progress created a roadmap for building trust with traumatized subjects. The environmental modifications developed for his quarters became standard specifications for new habitats. His nutritional formula served as the template for creating individualized feeding plans. His entire journey from condemnation to recovery offered hope where none had previously existed. His transformation proved that even the most compromised hybrids could achieve significant recovery with appropriate care. Dragons previously considered beyond help began showing improvements when treated with the methods developed for Phoenix. Respiratory functions that had been written off as permanently damaged responded to optimized atmospheres and gradual conditioning. Digestive systems adapted to customized nutrients despite previous rejection of all standard formulas. Behavioral changes followed established patterns of trust building and environmental enrichment. The evidence demonstrated that recovery was possible across the spectrum of hybrid conditions. The program achieved remarkable success rates that justified its continued expansion and funding. The methods proved consistently effective across different facilities and staff teams. Recovery timelines shortened as experience grew with various conditions and complications. Costs decreased as standardized environmental modifications and nutritional components became more readily available. The financial and medical outcomes supported further investment in the rehabilitation approach over previous termination protocols. Successful prototype cases often establish operational frameworks for broader implementation. The detailed documentation of Phoenix's journey provided specific guidance rather than theoretical concepts. His example demonstrated which interventions produced results and which approaches proved less effective. The trial and error period of his recovery eliminated guesswork for subsequent cases. The evidence created confidence in methods that might otherwise have seemed unproven or risky. New regulations addressed the genetic manipulation practices that had created the hybrids in the first place. Legislation established clear boundaries for acceptable research involving created lifeforms. Enforcement mechanisms penalized violations with significant consequences for individuals and organizations. Oversight requirements increased transparency in all genetic engineering programs. The changes reflected growing recognition that created beings deserved protection rather than disposal. The program expanded beyond medical rehabilitation into education and cultural documentation. Researchers began studying hybrid communication methods and social structures. Educational programs taught station staff about hybrid needs and behaviors. Historical records preserved the experiences of both the hybrids and their caregivers. The approach shifted from damage control to comprehensive understanding of these unique lifeforms. Phoenix's personal journey became the operational blueprint for humane treatment of genetic survivors. His story demonstrated that value exists beyond practical utility or research potential. His recovery proved that care should be measured by quality of life rather than functional perfection. His relationships showed that connection transcends biological origins or artificial creation. The methods developed through his transformation established new standards for how the colony values and cares for all life. Morning. Light from the habitat's simulated sunrise cycle fell across the main living area, painting the forest projection in soft gold and gray tones. The air carried the subtle scent of pine from the environmental systems, a familiar background note that signaled the start of another day. Samantha entered with the breakfast containers, her footsteps light on the textured flooring. Phoenix lifted his head from where he rested near the viewing port, his blue eyes tracking her movement with calm recognition. The daily ritual began as it had for countless mornings, a comfortable pattern that structured their shared existence. The physical and psychological scars of his past remained part of him despite the transformation. His breathing showed no trace of the labored struggle that had once defined his existence. Moving with smooth regularity in the optimized atmosphere, the silver line across his forehead had faded to a barely visible thread against his fur, but its presence marked where neural interfaces had once connected. The memories of sterile bays and medical procedures lingered in his reactions to unfamiliar sounds or sudden movements. These remnants served as permanent reminders of what he had survived rather than limitations on what he could become. He rose and moved to the feeding station as Samantha arranged the bowls in their designated positions. His attention shifted to the younger dragons still resting in their sleeping cluster. A soft rumble in his throat signaled the start of the morning routine, the sound deep and calm rather than alert or aggressive. The juveniles stirred at the familiar signal, uncurling from their shared warmth with gradual wakefulness. Phoenix positioned himself where he could observe the entire feeding process, his presence establishing order without need for intervention. His respiratory function showed no indication of the support systems that had once been necessary for survival. The air moving through his lungs encountered no resistance or inflammation, the optimized atmosphere maintaining perfect conditions for his unique physiology. The deep, even breaths demonstrated complete recovery where medical charts had once predicted irreversible decline. The transformation seemed particularly striking during these quiet morning moments when his body functioned with effortless precision. The silver scar across his forehead caught the light when he turned his head, a permanent record of his origins. The mark no longer showed inflammation or sensitivity, having healed into smooth tissue that differed only slightly from the surrounding fur. Its presence represented not damage but history, a visual connection to the journey he had completed. The neural interfaces that had caused the marking were now banned throughout the colony, their elimination one of many changes inspired by his recovery. Research into trauma recovery emphasizes the stabilizing effect of predictable routines on nervous system regulation. Daily patterns create psychological safety through repetition and predictability. The consistency allows recovered individuals to anticipate events rather than remaining in constant alertness. The morning ritual provided structure that supported ongoing stability while allowing flexibility within established boundaries. Phoenix completed his meal and began his morning patrol of the habitat boundaries. His movement followed a consistent route that circled the entire living space, pausing at specific points to check environmental readings or viewport settings. His steps carried confident ownership of the territory, the patrol serving both practical inspection and symbolic claim. The routine reinforced his role as guardian, while providing constant familiarization with his environment. The juveniles fell into line behind him as he moved, their formation mirroring his path and pace. They observed his checking of air quality sensors and temperature monitors, learning the patterns that maintained their environment. Their movements showed the same purposeful attention that Phoenix demonstrated, the imitation reflecting integrated learning rather than simple copying. The morning patrol became an educational exercise as well as a practical routine. Phoenix had transformed into the foundation upon which the small community operated. His presence provided stability for the younger dragons, his routines creating structure for their development. His relationship with Samantha modeled appropriate human interaction, demonstrating trust and cooperation. His physical recovery proved that transformation was possible even after severe trauma. The morning ritual represented not just individual habit, but the functioning of an integrated social unit, with Phoenix at its center as both example and anchor. Phoenix demonstrated that real recovery begins when someone sees value where others see ruin. His transformation challenged the very definition of viability in created life. What began as a medical intervention became a philosophical shift in how the colony views beings born of science. His legacy extended beyond his own survival to influence policies and practices across 12 stations. The program he inspired saved countless others who would have been discarded. The true miracle was not that he lived, but that he made us reconsider what makes a life worth saving, teaching us to recognize consciousness and worth in every being, however they came to exist.